Chapter 3 of the Necessity of Atheism. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Wesseling. The Necessity of Atheism by David Marshall Brooks. Chapter 3 The Prophets Mohammed, Jesus, and Moses. Charlatans or victims of mental and physical disease. The prophet or seer is a man of strong imaginative powers which have not been calmed by education. The ideas which occur to his mind often present themselves to his eyes and ears in corresponding sights and sounds. Prophets have existed in all countries and at all times, but the gift becomes rare in the same proportion as people learn to read and write. Winwood Reade. Religious apologists are forever reminding us that we must interpret both the lives and the works of their prophets and recorders in the spirit and meaning of the ages in which they lived. To this I agree, but the apologists have so mutilated the meaning of the words of the seers and built about them such a mass of nonsense, myth, and fable that it becomes nearly impossible, after the lapse of centuries, to differentiate the actual man from the fabled man. But there are certain facts that do come down to us, recorded by disinterested observers, from which can be derived finally some conception of their mode of life and the content and significance of their teachings. Although time causes great changes in customs and manners, it only affects a negligible variation in the vast majority of diseases which affect the body and mind of man. We know from the examination of the skeletal remains of prehistoric man that the diseases of the bone of thousands of years ago were similar in their manifestations to those same diseases of bone of today. From the writings of the early Egyptian, Greek, and Roman physicians, we identify diseases by their symptoms and recognize that the symptoms of these diseases have not changed throughout the ages. Therefore, with the knowledge of the signs and symptoms of various diseases which we have today, we can safely assert that if an ancient complained of the same group of signs and symptoms, which is now termed a disease complex, he was suffering from the same disease which we can identify in modern man. What applies to physical disease is just as applicable to mental disease. In speaking of mental disease, it is important for the layman to keep in mind a few fundamental principles held by the physician. The physician, in speaking of mental disease, means a more or less permanent departure from the normal or usual way of thinking, acting, or feeling. In the examination of a patient with mental disease, the physician looks for delusions, illusions, and hallucinations. A delusion is a false belief, concerning which the individual who holds it is unable to admit evidence such as would be admitted by ordinary individuals. An illusion is a deception of the senses, a misinterpretation of sensory impressions. The normal person can be convinced of this deception. The mirage, for example, is an optical illusion which has a starting point in an external stimulus. A hallucination is a deception of any of the five senses, in which there is no starting point, but it is fabricated in a disordered mind. Illustrations of hallucinations are the hearing of voices when none are present, smelling of odors, and seeing of visions in a vacuum. With the elementary understanding of fundamental symptoms of mental diseases as a point of departure, let us consider the cases of Mohammed, Jesus, and Moses, three of the most influential prophets in the history of civilization. Mohammed. Of the three, Mohammed should be considered before the others for several reasons. First, there is no question regarding the actual existence of Mohammed. We know that he was born at Mecca about 571 AD and died at Medina on June the 8th, 632 AD. From the facts of his life and the religion which he founded, we are able to see the manner in which legend and superstition were superimposed on its original simple form. The historical records of his life and teachings are easier of access since he is nearer our time than the other two prophets, and we can get a better understanding of his character. It was Gibbon who said, "It may be expected that I should balance his faults and his virtues, that I should decide whether the title of enthusiast or impostor more properly belongs to that extraordinary man. At the distance of 12 centuries, I darkly contemplate his shade through a cloud of incense." In attempting to peer through this cloud of religious incense, we find the following facts. In the city of Mecca, probably in August in the year 571, Mohammed, the Prophet of Allah, was born. There seems little doubt that he was descended from those lofty Quraysh, whose opposition, which at first nearly succeeded in holding his name in perpetual oblivion, eventually caused him to emerge into the light of deathless fame. His birth was surrounded by all manner of signs and omens, we are told. The labor of his mother Amina was entirely painless. Earthquakes loosed the bases of mountains and caused great bodies of water, whose names were unfortunately not specified, to wither away or overflow. The sacred fire of Zoroaster, which, under the jealous care of the Magi, had spouted ceaseless flames for nearly 1,000 years, was extinguished. All the idols in the world except the Kaaba tumbled to earth. Immediately after the babe was born, an ethereal light dazzled the surrounding territory, and on the very moment when his eyes were first opened, he lifted them to heaven and exclaimed, "God is great! There is no God but Allah, and I am his prophet." All these poetic fancies have been appropriately denounced by Christian scribes, who have claimed that nature would never have dignified the birth of a pagan like Mohammed with such marvelous prodigies as undoubtedly attended the advent of Christ. However, Mohammed was born shortly after the death of his father. At the age of 6 his mother died also, and he spent the first 10 years among the Bedouins under the care of a foster mother named Halima. At the age of 4 it was noticed that the child had signs of convulsive seizures, which later commentators thought were of an epileptic nature. He was brought up under the care of his uncle, Abu Talib, and his early manhood was spent in caring for the flock and in attending caravan expeditions. When the Prophet was 25 years old, his uncle secured for him a position with a caravan owned by a wealthy widow, Khadija. Thanks to Mohammed's keen business sense, the caravan was highly successful, and he was induced to personally report his success to Khadija. That lady, a wealthy widow of 40 years and the mother of 3 children, was highly pleased at Mohammed's story. As she listened to the proof of his business ability and fondly scanned his large, nobly formed head, his curling coal-black hair, his piercing eyes, and his comely form, it naturally occurred to her that this vigorous and handsome young fellow would make an excellent successor to her deceased husband. She had her way, and they were married. During the next 15 years, Mohammed led a tranquil life. His future was provided for, and he had plenty of leisure to occupy himself as he chose. In these years, Mohammed and his wife continued to be conventional worshippers of idols, who nightly performed rites in honor of various gods and goddesses, among whom were Allah and his female consoler, Al-Lat. And so, by the year 610, Mohammed, at the age of 40, was nothing more than a respectable but unknown tradesman, who had experienced no extraordinary crises, whose few existing utterances were dull and insipid, and whose life seemed destined to remain as insignificant and unsung as any other Arab. At this time, he began to retire for days at a time to a cave in the foothills of Mount Hira, a hill several miles north of Mecca. Meanwhile his business languished. As the months passed, he still continued to act in the same incomprehensible manner. It was noticed that little by little certain members of his immediate family attended him to his refuge or gathered with him in some one of their houses. This continued for several years, until it was rumored that Mohammed the camel driver was confidently claiming the honor of having made a great discovery, namely, that there is no God but Allah, and Mohammed is his prophet. By what process of thought had Mohammed come to exalt Allah not merely above all Arabian gods, but above the gods of all times? Furthermore, why was he so certain of his own intimate association with Allah? We can understand this if we consider Mohammed in the light of a victim of mental disease. One account informs us that as Mohammed was wandering near the cave at Mount Hira, an angel from the sky cried to him, "O Mohammed, I am Gabriel." He was terrified and hurried home to impart his experience to his wife. "I see a light," he said to his wife, "and I hear a sound. I fear that I am possessed." This idea was most distressing to a pious man. He became pale, haggard, and wandered about on the hill near Mecca crying for help to God. More than once he drew near the edge of the cliff and was tempted to hurl himself down, and so put an end to his misery at once. He lived much in the open air, gazing on the stars, watching the dry ground grow green beneath the gentle rain. He pondered also on the religious legends of the Jews, which he had heard related on his journeys. And as he looked and thought, the darkness was dispelled, the clouds disappeared, and the vision of God in solitary grandeur rose within his mind, and there came upon him an impulse to speak of God. There came upon him a belief that he was a messenger of God sent to earth to restore the religion of Abraham, which the pagan Arabs had polluted with idolatry, the Jews in corrupting their holy books. At the same time he heard a voice, and sometimes he felt a noise in his ears like the tinkling of bells or a low, deep hum, as if bees were swarming around his head. At this period of his life, the chapters of the Koran were delivered in throes of pain. The paroxysms were preceded by depression of spirit. His face became clouded, his extremities turned cold, he shook like a man in an ague, and he called for coverings. His face assumed an expression horrible to see. The vein between his eyebrows became distended, his eyes were fixed, his head moved to and fro as if he was conversing, and then he gave forth the oracle, or surah. The hitherto mentally and emotionally normal trader, husband, and father was thus suddenly swept off his feet and carried irresistibly away on a mighty tide. His perturbed spirit now soared to the heights of heaven, now plunged into the chasms of hell. Moments of ethereal bliss would be followed by periods of profoundest melancholy. It is related that the angel Gabriel, who thus far had labored only in the field of Christian endeavor, was chosen by Allah as bearer of the divine revelation to Mohammed. One day, while the trader poet was wrestling with his doubts among the foothills of Mount Hira, he saw a wondrous apparition floating downward on celestial wings. "Thou art God's prophet, and I am Gabriel," announced the awe-inspiring guest, before he departed to receive the blessing of Allah for having so successfully executed the heavenly command. Gabriel was a very valuable ambassador, for through the to and fro journeying of this indefatigable messenger, Allah was able to remain at ease in heaven, thus keeping up the appearance of intangible, majestic remoteness so necessary for dignified gods. And thus Mohammed came into his own. From that moment, Mohammed looked upon himself as Allah's vice-regent, through whom Allah's incontestable decrees were to be given to man. Mohammed's every doubt had now vanished, his soul was completely at ease, and from his lips there burst the wildly exultant chant, "There is no God but Allah, and Mohammed is his prophet." The obliging Gabriel, he said, had borne him on a winged steed over Medina to the Temple of Jerusalem, and from there he continued his celestial journey until he was carried completely up out of this world to those ethereal realms of bliss where the seven heavens are. Up and up he flew, while he carefully noted the order of precedence of those prophets whose model he had proclaimed himself to be. Jesus and John were in the second or third, he was not quite sure which. Moses was in the sixth, while Abraham alone had the supreme distinction of residing in the seventh heaven. There, at the apex of indescribable glory, Mohammed had entered the awful presence of his Maker, who, after some chit-chat, charged him to see that all Muslims should hereafter prostrate themselves in prayer toward the Temple of Solomon 5 times a day. The truth of this narrative rests upon two solid facts. From that day to this, all devout Muslims have continued to bow themselves 5 times daily in prayer, and skeptics may still see, upon the rock where stands the Mosque of Omar in Jerusalem, the identical print of the Prophet's foot where he leapt upon the heavenly charger. His thoughts, whether conceived in a white heat of frenzy, or with deliberate coolness and sly calculations for the main chance, were probably not written down in any definite manner during his lifetime. It is not even certain whether he could read or write. He delighted in the appellation the illiterate prophet, possibly on account of his humility, and possibly because he knew that inspired ignorance had been the indisputable prerogative of all successful prophets in the past. Indeed, the very fact that he was unlearned was rightly supposed to increase the miraculous nature of his revelations. As he tossed the divine emancipations from his lips, they were sometimes recorded by hireling scribes upon palm leaves, leather, stones, the shoulder blades or ribs of camels and goats, but often they were not immediately written down at all. The prophet would go around spouting forth his utterances to his followers, who, trained from infancy to memorize verses and songs of every sort with infallible precision, would piously commit them to memory. Such is the Koran, and through its instrumentality, Allah the Wise, the only wise, revealed his immutable decrees. To the good, the rewards of a paradise that utterly beggared the Christian heaven. To the bad, the punishments of a hell that contained an infinity of such refined tortures of heat and even of cold as neither the most imaginatively gifted Jew or Christian had yet conceived. Reinach aptly states, "It is humiliating to the human intellect to think that this mediocre literature has been the subject of innumerable commentaries and that millions of men are still wasting time in absorbing it. Over 160 million are adherents of the Koran." In an objective analysis, excluding the emotional factors of religious bias, Mohammed would as unquestionably be considered a victim of mental disturbances as an individual living in our own day and manifesting the same symptoms. Mohammed was the subject of illusions, hallucinations, and delusions. He had suicidal tendencies, and he had alternating periods of exhilaration and depression. To simply assert that he was an epileptic does not explain these symptoms, for epileptics cannot throw a fit at will. However, we know that 10% of epileptics develop mental diseases, no particular psychosis, but a loss of mental and moral sense. There are two types of individuals who can produce seizures such as Mohammed was wont to evoke at will. One type is the hysterical, and the other is that degraded individual who, for the sake of collecting alms, will place a piece of soap in his mouth, enter a crowded street, fall to the ground, and proceed to foam at the mouth and twist and contort himself as an epileptic does. That is the charlatan, the faker, and that brings us to the second aspect of his, Mohammed's, character. Outside of Arabia, paganism was in general disrepute. The dissolute and declining Romans were cracking lewd jokes in the very faces of their gods. The myriad followers of Confucius, Buddha, and Zoroaster were either too remote or too helpless to matter in one way or another. Talmudic Judaism and Oriental Christianity despised idolatry and worshipped the same Jehovah, even though they disputed with each other, and indeed among themselves, concerning the various attributes, amorous pursuits, and lineal descendants of the Godhead. Now to one who chose to regard himself as a prophet, monotheism had distinct advantages over polytheism. In the first place, it was rather confusing to attempt to obey the behests of conflicting deities. In the second place, the different prophets of Jehovah in Judaism and Christendom had, so far as Mohammed knew, been uniformly successful, for he was familiar with the glorious history of Abraham, Moses, and David, and he always held to the perverse conception that Jesus was not crucified. However deep in the dumps prophets may have been on occasion, they have invariably believed one thing: victory for their particular cause would inevitably come. Neither an unbroken series of worldly failures nor the chastisement of his God have ever shaken the faith of a first-class prophet in himself, or, as he would doubtless prefer to say, in his divinity. Arabia, broken, unorganized, inglorious, idolistic Arabia, obviously lacked one supreme being whose prerogative was greater than all other supreme beings, and that being, in turn, needed a messenger to exploit his supremacy. The messengers who had served Jehovah had certainly prospered well, but Jehovah himself appeared to be on the decline. His unity was steadily disintegrating into a paradoxical trinity. Why, therefore, not give Allah, the leading icon in Arabia, an opportunity? Such considerations quite probably never entered the head of Mohammed with any definiteness, yet his behavior for the rest of his days seems to indicate that these or similar conceptions were subconsciously egging him on. Of certain facts, moreover, he was definitely aware. He may have had little or no formal education, but his memory was retentive and capacious, and his caravan journeys, together with the scores of conversations he had held at the yearly fairs, as well as at Mecca, with many cultivated strangers, had packed his mind with a mass of highly valuable matter. In these ways, he had learned both the strength and the weakness of the Jews and the Christians, their fanatical enthusiasm and despairs, their spasmodic attempts to proselytize, as well as the widespread defection from their faiths. Since his conception of religion was largely personal, for he looked upon Moses, Jesus, and the rest of the prophets as merely capable men who had founded and promulgated religions, and since Arabia had no preeminent ruler, why should he not seize the reins of power and carry on the great tradition of prophethood? What a magnificent opportunity beckoned, and how fortunate that he had been the first to recognize the call. By keeping only what was best of the Arabic faith, the Kaaba and the Black Stone, and by a judicious selection of the most feasible ideas which lay embedded in Jewish and Christian precepts, he might establish a code that would supersede all others, and then might dictate to all Arabs alike what prophets had done he would also do, and do better. Such are the thoughts of a charlatan and a demagogue. If Mohammed actually had such ideas, we can never know, but a study of his further actions and conquests surely shows that he must have had something of the same trend of thought in mind. His fits before the oncoming of a new surah have been mentioned. Eventually he so perfected his technique that he could throw a cataleptic fit and produce a message without any previous preparation. He would drum up a crowd with his ludicrous snortings and puffings until the resounding cry, "Inspiration hath descended on the Prophet," assured him that he had a sufficiently large audience to warrant the outspurting of a new surah. While in a room that was obviously empty, he declared that all seats were occupied by angels. He cultivated suave and benign expression. He flattered and astounded his followers by telling them facts which he had presumably acquired through private information. He took the most painstaking care of his person, painting his eyes and perfuming his entire body daily, and wearing his hair long. Ayesha, one of the Prophet's wives, remarked that the Prophet loved three things: women, scent, and food, and that he had his heart's content of the first two, but not of the last. In fact, Mohammed himself argued that these two innocuous diversions intensified the ecstasy of his prayers. In the Koran's description of heaven, so much emphasis was put on food that a jolly Jew objected on the grounds that such continual feasting must of necessity be followed by a purgation. The Prophet, however, swore that it would not even be necessary to blow the nose in paradise, since all bodily impurities would be carried off by a perspiration as odoriferous as musk. When his wife Khadija was dying, he comforted her with the assurance that she, together with three other well-known women, the Virgin Mary, Potiphar's wife, and Kulthum, Moses' sister, would occupy his chamber in paradise. On Mohammed's escape to Medina, a long series of holy wars began which, like all holy wars, were characterized by extreme brutality. The Koran of the period contains such pacific doctrines as these: the sword is the key of heaven and hell; a drop of blood shed in the cause of God, a night spent in arms, is of more avail than 2 months of fasting or prayer. Whosoever falls in battle, his sins are forgiven. At the day of judgment his wounds shall be resplendent as vermilion, and odoriferous as musk, and the loss of limbs shall be supplied by the wings of angels and cherubim. God loveth not the transgressors. Kill them wheresoever ye find them. Mohammed, no less than any other religiously minded emperors and tsars, appears to have conducted himself in battle according to the wise principle that a head without a halo is infinitely more desirable than a halo without a head. Yet he was profoundly convinced that the ultimate victory of Islam depended upon the sword. The Koran of this period breathes defiance against the enemies of Islam on almost every page. Its profuse maledictions, once confined to the evildoers of Mecca, now include all unbelievers everywhere. When Mohammed once had captured a fortress inhabited by a tribe of Jews, his judgment was, "The men shall be put to death, the women and children sold into slavery, and the spoil divided amongst the army." Then trenches were dug, some 700 men were marched out, forced to seat themselves in rows along the top of the trenches, beheaded, and then tumbled into a long gaping grave. Meanwhile, the Prophet looked on, until, tiring of the monotonous spectacle, he departed to amuse himself with a Jewess whose husband had just perished. He continued these conquests until, at his death in 632, he was the master of nearly all Arabia and revered almost as a god. Yet when Omar, his first lieutenant, captured Jerusalem in 636, he ensured the conquered Jews and Christians free exercise of their religion and the security of their persons and their goods. But when the Crusaders took Jerusalem in 1099, they massacred all the Mohammedans and burnt the Jews alive. It is estimated that 70,000 persons were put to death in less than a week to attest the superior morality of the Christian faith. The successors of Mohammed, the Caliphs, in less than a century conquered Syria, Egypt, Babylonia, Persia, Turkestan, Spain, Northern Africa, Sicily, and southern France. Today, 160 million are followers of Mohammed, a man who began as a humble religious leader and ended as an adroit politician and powerful general, a man who hid during battles, who often broke faith with friend and foe alike, a charlatan and demagogue of general intellectual incompetency, and a victim of mental disease. Jesus. When we come to consider the life of Jesus, a far different and more intricate problem is met with. None but the most illogical and purposely ignorant of religious apologists will admit that the life of Jesus has been misrepresented by his followers to suit their particular aims. Had the followers of the moralist Epictetus or the Rabbi Hillel written lives of those two teachers, they would be quite similar to the reputed life of Jesus. The moral sentiments attributed to Christ in the Gospels were borrowed from the Jewish rabbis and the numerous cults that flourished in that age. The birth, death, and resurrection of Christ is quite similar to the myths of that time concerning the savior gods Adonis, Isis, Osiris, Attis, Mithra, and a multitude of others. For a full exposition of the subject, the reader is referred to E. Carpenter, Pagan and Christian Creeds. The evidence for the point of view that Jesus was actually a historic character is so slight that such scholars as J. M. Robertson, Professor W. B. Smith, Professor Drews, Dr. P. L. Cochode, and many others deny the historic reality of Christ on the ground that the Gospels are totally unreliable as history, that Paul bears no witness to a human Jesus, and that the pagan and Jewish writers are strangely silent about the Messiah Jesus. There are in existence only 24 lines from Jewish and pagan writers referring to Jesus. These include a reference in Tacitus's Annals, and brief references by Suetonius and Pliny the Younger. These three references are considered spurious by many scholars, and even if they were all to be accepted, it would mean that the total pagan testimony as to the historicity of Jesus is confined to three very vague and brief references written a century after the reputed time of Jesus. The longest reference to Jesus is in the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus. The passage referring to Jesus in his Jewish Antiquities has been considered as spurious even by conservative scholars. A group of scholars has always deemed it very probable, however, that this spurious reference may have replaced an unfavorable reference to Jesus in the original. Working on this theory, Dr. Eisler has purged of interpolations this work by a painstaking and scholarly investigation. However, it must be pointed out that with regard to Jesus' actual existence, what divided the Christians and non-Christians was not the question whether or not Jesus existed, but the vastly more pertinent and essentially different question whether or not the obscure Galilean carpenter, executed by a Roman governor as King of the Jews, was really a superhuman being who had overcome death, the longed-for Savior of mankind, foretold by the prophets, the only begotten Son of God himself. To the Jews, Jesus was indeed a heretic and an agitator of the lower orders. To the pagans, he was a magician who through sham miracles and with subversive words had incited the people to rebellion, and as a leader of a gang of desperate men had attempted to seize the royal crown of Judea as others had done before him and after him. The non-Christian writers referred to Jesus as a wizard, a demagogue, and a rebel. We are fortunate at this date to have brought to our attention a masterful work by Dr. Robert Eisler, a work which will be as revolutionary to the study of Christianity as was Darwin's Origin of the Species in the realms of science, and similarly, the former work will be the basis upon which much progress will be made in a great field. Dr. Eisler unfolds a great mass of hitherto unknown information concerning the life, the actual appearance, and the doings of Jesus. He definitely establishes the proof of Jesus' actual existence, and makes clear many hitherto obscure utterances and deeds of this prophet. The descriptions which follow are based on the material in this work of Dr. Eisler, The Messiah Jesus. In the complete statement of Josephus on Pilate's governorship, we find, "At that time there appeared a certain man of magical power, if it is permissible to call him a man, whom certain Greeks call a son of God, but his disciples the true prophet, said to raise the dead and heal all diseases. His nature and his form were human, a man of simple appearance, mature age, small in stature, 3 cubits high, hunchbacked, with a long face, long nose, and meeting eyebrows, so that they who see him might be affrighted, with scanty hair, but with a parting in the middle of his head, after the manner of the Nazarites, and with an undeveloped beard. Only in semblance was he superhuman, for he gave some astonishing and spectacular exhibitions. But again, if I look at his commonplace physique, I, for one, cannot call him an angel. And everything whatsoever he wrought through some invisible power, he wrought through some word and a command. Some said of him, "Our first lawgiver is risen again, and displays many healings and magic arts." Others said, "He is sent from God." Howbeit in many things he disobeyed the law, and kept not the Sabbath, according to our fathers' custom. And many of the multitude followed after him, and accepted his teachings, and many souls were excited, thinking that thereby the Jewish tribes might be freed from Roman hands. But it was his custom most of the time to abide over against the city on the Mount of Olives, and there too he bestowed his healings upon the people. And there assembled unto him of helpers 150, and a multitude of the mob. Now when they saw his power, how he accomplished whatsoever he would by a magic word, and when they had made known to him their will, that he should enter into the city, cut down the Roman troops, and Pilate, and rule over us, he disdained us not. And having all flocked into Jerusalem, they raised an uproar against Pilate, uttering blasphemies alike against God and against Caesar. And when knowledge of it came to the Jewish leaders, they assembled together with the high priests, and spake, "We are powerless and too weak to withstand the Romans. But, seeing that the bow is bent, we will go and impart to Pilate what we have heard, and we shall be safe, lest he hear of it from others, and we be robbed of our substance, and ourselves slaughtered, and the children of Israel dispersed." And they went and imparted the matter to Pilate, and he sent and had many of the multitude slain. And he had that wonder worker brought up, and after instituting an inquiry concerning him, he passed his sentence upon him. He is a malefactor, a rebel, a robber, thirsting for the crown. And they took him and crucified him according to the custom of their fathers. Such is the history of Jesus as contrasted with the myth of Jesus in the New Testament. This description of the actual appearance of Jesus for the first time gives us a clue to the mental and physical characteristics of this prophet. It must be borne in mind that at the time that Jesus achieved manhood, his people and his nation were under the complete domination of Rome, and oppressed by a race whom the Jews looked upon as cursed barbarians and idolaters. The country was overrun with religious zealots who stormed over the cities and villages, preaching the immediate destruction of the world and the proximity of the long-awaited coming of the Messiah. The fact that Jesus had to bear the hard fate of a deformed body may go far in helping to explain this remarkable character. It is common knowledge how frequently weak and deformed children have to suffer from the cruelty and neglect of environment, a factor which cannot but produce a peculiar reaction on the childish mind which has a far-reaching effect in later life. This accounts for Jesus' indifference towards his mother and brothers. Of a delicate constitution, he might have suffered from insults a great deal more than the others, which throws some light on the severe punishment demanded by Jesus for comparatively harmless insults. Under such circumstances, it is easy to explain how every neighbor and next of kin, although to the weak naturally an enemy, came to be included in the sphere of that all-embracing love which is the nucleus of Jesus' teaching. For the cripple has to face the dilemma either of warping everything into a powerful, misanthropic hatred, or else to overcome this feeling of revenge for the high moral superiority of a Plato, Mendelssohn, or a Kant. Jesus chose the latter of the two courses, and we may well imagine that it was not at Golgotha that he had the first occasion to cry out, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." In the case of Jesus, the whole paradoxical thought of his being the vicarious sin offering and world redeemer can best be understood as the solution proposed in the Deutero-Isaiah of the question which had occupied Job, to wit, why must the innocent suffer? If the maimed in body refuse to consider himself as forsaken by his God, as a sinner punished for some guilt of which he is unconscious, he cannot but assume that there is such a thing as a vocation to suffering, and believe in the inscrutable plan of salvation in which his own life and sufferings are called upon to play some part. Nothing but this conviction of being thus elected can afford him the desired compensation for his depressed and hampered ego. A repressed nature of this type will, in seeking such a compensation, escape from the harsh reality into the realm of dreams. This is the basis of what the physician recognizes in hysteria, and in the mental disease termed dementia praecox. The glorious daydreams of the millennium, the time of bliss, when all strife and all hate will disappear from the earth, when all the crooked will be made straight, find their best explanation in this peculiarity. They console the suffering and heavy laden for the bitter reality which, in the light of the old messianic prophecies, appears only as a nightmare, promptly to be chased away by the dawn of a new day, a perfect era. The Davidic Jesus, in spite or rather because of his servile form, feels that he is himself the secret incognito king of that wonderful realm, the monarch whom God sometime in the future, nay, right here, and before the passing of the present generation, will transform, while at the same time revealing his kingdom. It is but natural that in the mental development of such individuals they should seek to be great, glorious, and to achieve the supernatural, since they themselves are denied the ordinary satisfactions. If, in addition, such individuals believe that they have had a divine call, if the disability of the body so preys on the mind that the sensitive structure gives way to delusions, then there results an aberration from the normal and usual processes of thought. To be sure, not the rabid, violent form of mental disease, but yet a deviation from the normal manner of thinking. Such was the case with the prophet Jesus. Afflicted in body but endowed with a sensitive mind, exposed to an unusual environment of seething unrest and political ferment, and firmly convinced in the current fancies regarding the approaching destruction of the world, the conquest of the evil power, and the reign of God, Jesus became the subject of a delusion that he was the only true Messiah who had been presaged by the prophets of old. The greatest difficulty encountered in every attempt to present the life and work of Jesus according to the evidence of his own words, preserved in the sources, is the sharp, irreconcilable contradiction between the so-called fire and sword sayings on the one side, and the beatitudes on the peacemakers and the meek, the prohibition to kill, to be angry, to resist wrong, and the command to love one's enemy contained in the Sermon on the Mount on the other. In the early period of his messianic career, the period of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus was a thorough quietist. But if we realize that the delusion that he was the Messiah had entered his mind so vehemently that he firmly believed that the end of the world was imminent, and that it was his duty to save as many as possible, we can understand his acquiescence to the violence which followed. Moreover, he was clearly forced to the fatal road by the idea that he must set on foot a movement of hundreds of thousands, the picture of the Exodus from Egypt with the fantastic figures given in the Old Testament. The messianic rising he was to initiate could not be regarded as realized if he left the country with a band of some 100 elect. If he wished, however, to put at least 2/5 of the population in motion, the method of sending out messengers had proved altogether unsatisfactory. He must try the effect of his own words in a place where, and at a time when, he was sure to reach the greatest multitude of his people. That could only be in Jerusalem, at the time of the great pilgrimage at the feast of the Passover. Moreover, the desired result could only be obtained, of course, if he openly proclaimed himself to be the Messiah. Then it was that the Prophet of Quiet reversed his words and armed his disciples. Jesus was fully aware of the illegality of this arming of his disciples, and of his own direction to purchase a weapon. Nonetheless, he saw no escape from this bitter necessity. The prediction of the prophet must be fulfilled, according to which the righteous servant of the Lord must be numbered among the lawless transgressors. True it is that he did not lead the revolt himself, but tarried with his disciples at the Last Supper at a house near by the fighting. When he becomes aware that his secret hiding place on the Mount of Olives has been betrayed, Jesus hopes for a miracle from God up to the last. Captured, he is led away to the palace of the high priest's family on the Mount of Olives, where, while Jesus is questioned by the high priest, Peter, unrecognized, warms himself at the fire in the courtyard and thrice denies his master. He was then taken to the Roman governor's court-martial, where sentence was passed, and he was led off to the place of execution, and there deserted by all of his followers except a few Galilean women. Then was heard the last despairing cry of the desolate, dying martyr, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Thus ended the career of this deformed prophet with the sensitive, deluded mind, a martyr who attempted only to effect reforms amongst his own people, in his own small locality. Moses. With regard to the life, the deeds, and the words of the prophet Moses, we have no history, only myth and legend. The existence of Moses is not demonstrated by the biblical books which are falsely ascribed to him, yet we cannot be certain that such a character did not exist. In any event, we must judge his character from the writings ascribed to him. The legend of the child cast upon the waters is to be found in the folklore of all nations. This legend concerning Moses relates that one day Pharaoh's daughter, while bathing with her maids in the Nile, found a Hebrew child exposed on the waters in obedience to a new decree. She adopted the boy, gave him an Egyptian name, and brought him up in her palace as a prince. She had him educated, and the fair inference is that he was schooled in the culture of the Egyptians. The royal lady made of the Hebrew slave child an Egyptian gentleman. Yet, although his face was shaved, and outwardly he appeared to be an Egyptian, at heart he remained a Hebrew. One day, when he was grown, Moses went slumming amongst his own people to look at their burdens, and he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew. He was so overcome by passion at this scene that he killed the man on the spot. The crime became known, there was a hue and cry raised, and the king had a search made for Moses with the intention of slaying him. With all hope of a career in Egypt ended, Moses escaped to the peninsula of Sinai and entered the family of an Arab sheikh. The peninsula of Sinai lies clasped between two arms of the Red Sea. It is a wilderness of mountains covered with a thin, almost transparent coating of vegetation, which serves as pasture to the Bedouin flocks. Among the hills that crown the high plateau, there is one which, at the time of Moses, was called the Mount of God. It was holy ground to the Egyptians and also to the Arabs, who ascended as pilgrims and drew off their sandals when they reached the top. Now is it strange that Sinai should have excited reverence and dread? It is indeed a weird land. Vast and stern stand the mountains, with their 5 granite peaks pointing to the sky. Avalanches like those of the Alps, but of sand, not of snow, rush down their naked sides with a clear tinkling sound. A peculiar property resides in the air. The human voice can be heard at a surprising distance and swells out into a reverberating roar, and sometimes there rises from among the hills a dull booming sound like the distant firing of heavy guns. Let us attempt to realize what Moses must have felt when he was driven out of Egypt into such a harsh and rugged land. Imagine this man, the adopted son of a royal personage, who was accustomed to all the splendor of the Egyptian court, to the busy turmoil of the streets of the metropolis, to reclining in a carpeted gondola, or staying with a noble at his country house. In a moment all is changed. He dwells in a tent, alone on the mountainside, a shepherd with a crook in his hand. He is married to the daughter of a barbarian. His career is at an end. He realizes that never again will he enter that palace where once he was received with honor, where now his name is uttered only with contempt. Never again will he discourse with grave and learned men in his favorite haunts, and never again will he see the people of his tribe whom he loves and for whom he endures this miserable fate. They will suffer, but he will not help them. They will mourn, but he will not hear them. In his dreams he hears and sees them. He hears the whistling of the lash and the convulsive sobs and groans. He sees the poor slaves toiling in the fields, and sees the daughters of Israel carried off to the harem with struggling arms and streaming hair. He sees the chamber of the woman in labor, the seated, shuddering, writhing form, the mother struggling against maternity, dreading her release, for the king's officer is standing by the door, ready, as soon as a male child is born, to put it to death. The Arabs who gave him shelter were also children of Abraham, and they related to him legends of the ancient days. They told him of the patriarchs who lay buried in Canaan with their wives. They spoke of the God whom his fathers had worshipped. Then, as one who returns to a long-lost home, the Egyptian returned to the faith of the desert, to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. As he wandered on the mountain heights, he looked to the west and saw a desert. Beyond it lay Canaan, the home of his ancestors, a land of peace and soon to be a land of hope. For now, new ideas rose tumultuously within him. He began to see visions and to dream dreams. He heard voices and beheld no form. He saw trees which blazed with fire and yet were not consumed. He became a prophet and entered into the ecstatic stage. That is, he began to have illusions and hallucinations. Dwelling on the misery and suffering of his people, his mind becomes deluded with the idea that he has been chosen by his newfound God to liberate his people from the tyranny of their oppressors. Meanwhile, the king had died, and a new pharaoh had ascended the throne. Moses returns to Egypt to carry out the great designs which he had formed. He announces to the elders of his people, to the heads of the houses, and the sheikhs of the tribes, that the God of Abraham had appeared to him in Sinai and had revealed his true name. It was Jehovah. He had been sent by Jehovah to Egypt to bring away his people, to lead them to Canaan. In company with his brother Aaron, Moses asked Pharaoh to liberate the children of Israel. But after several vain attempts to dazzle Pharaoh with his skill as a magician, he was met with an obstinate refusal. Moses, before Pharaoh, descends to the level of a vulgar sorcerer, armed with a magic wand, whose performances only draw our smiles. This charlatanry having been unsuccessful, the wizard connives with his accomplice Jehovah to have inflicted upon the Egyptians the 10 plagues. Then the loving and kind father, having killed innumerable Egyptians as the story relates, so terrorizes the minds of his other children in Egypt that Pharaoh is finally convinced that he must allow the chosen people to leave his domain. The Israelites quitted Egypt, carrying away with them the gold and silver of their oppressors. They then entered the desert. The magic art of Moses enabled them to pass dry-footed through the Red Sea, whereas the Pharaoh who was pursuing them was engulfed with his whole army. Again, the chosen people are liberated by means of the death of multitudes of Egyptians. Truly, Jehovah at that time must have loved them well, or did some other deity form the Egyptians? It matters not that the crossing of the Red Sea and the drowning of Pharaoh are romantic incidents, not only unknown to the Egyptian texts, but even to the earliest of Hebrew prophets. It matters not, for the story is the most important thing, even though it is an inspired story, inspired by the Jehovah who tortured and killed the Egyptians to show how well he loved his people. This Wild West story, with its multitudes of slaughters, proceeds to the wilderness of Sinai, and there again the prophet Moses goes into a secret seance and finally announces that God has delivered laws to him, which had been issued from the clouds. What a great showman was this prophet! Barnum must have been a devoted admirer of Moses, for Moses was the first to create the two-ring circus. For these laws given by Jehovah are described in two places, and the circus varies in both places. Exodus 20 and Exodus 34 are the two texts which differ considerably. To further convince the children of Israel, Moses tells them the story of how he had cajoled Jehovah into allowing him to see what no man had hitherto seen, the form of Jehovah. For it appears that Jehovah was so pleased with this murderer, charlatan, and wizard that he allowed him to glimpse his hind quarters. At least Jehovah had a sense of humor. What a bag of tricks this prophet had at his command! The prophet waves his arms and tugs at his gown, and lo and behold, the Lord has spoken. The following is a specimen of the revelations which the Lord is supposed to have dictated to Moses. Leviticus 14:25. The priest shall take some of the blood of the trespass offering, and put it upon the tip of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, and upon the thumb of his right hand, and upon the great toe of his right foot. And the priest shall pour of the oil into the palm of his own left hand, and shall sprinkle with his right finger some of the oil that is in his left hand 7 times before the Lord. Surely it must have been a God with a superior mentality who dictated this, for it surpasses our feeble comprehension. And we can well imagine Jehovah's wrath when the priest confuses his right and left. Twirling his arms again, Moses gives forth this oracle. Numbers 15:37-41. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and bid them that they make them a fringe upon the corner of their garments throughout their generations, and that they put upon the fringe of each corner a cord of blue, etc., etc. Jehovah chooses blue as the divine color. Royal purple, divine blue. Then there is the familiar myth of the prophet's tapping of the rock to bring forth water in the desert, the story of the manna, the tale of the doves. Thus can the fabled life of Moses be divided into 2 stages: the early period of illusions, hallucinations, and delusions, and the later stage of wizardry, charlatanry, and demagoguery. Neither must we think that we moderns are the first to peer through this sham, for what the Israelites thought of these laws appears from the bitter criticism of Moses and Aaron, which the Haggadah put into the mouth of the rebel Korah. When we were given the 10 Commandments, each of us learnt them directly from Mount Sinai. There were only the 10 Commandments, and we heard no orders about offering cake, or gifts to priests, or tassels. It was only in order to usurp the dominion for himself and to impart honor to his brother Aaron that Moses added all this. Moses, Jesus, and Mohammed, these prophets whose adherents number hundreds of millions, about whom there has been built up these vast systems of theology, what is there of the divine in their characters? What supernatural in their deeds? What wisdom poured forth from their lips which did not come from other philosophers? What immense structures have been founded on these shifting sands, on this morass of ignorance and childish fable? How long can these structures endure, aided by the bolstering up of the theologists, and how long must it be before the light of reason will pierce these foundations of blindness and force them to topple over? How much longer before humanity can begin to build on a sound foundation? Moses, Jesus, and Mohammed, revolutionists 3. Moses at the head of a weak, squabbling, and disgruntled group of Hebrew desert marauders, Jesus sanctioning the insurrection against Rome, Mohammed at the head of his Arabian marauders. If the free thinkers firmly believe that in them dwell the hope for a better humanity, for an exhilarated progress, for universal freedom and liberty for all mankind, and emancipation from fear and superstition, then they too must destroy. They must first undo the wrong before they can proceed to build on a right foundation. They must build on the cornerstone that all religion is human in its origin, erroneous in its theories, and ridiculous in its threats and rewards. Religion is the greatest impediment to the progress of human happiness. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of the Necessity of Atheism. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Wesseling. The Necessity of Atheism by David Marshall Brooks. Chapter 4. Soundness of a Foundation for a Belief in a Deity. It is better to bury a delusion and forget it, than to insult its memory by retaining the name when the thing has perished. F. H. Bradley. 1,000 miraculous happenings have been honored by the testimony of the ancients, which in later times, under a more exacting and skeptical scrutiny, can no longer be believed. Inherent in man's nature is his disposition to be gulled. Emotion is encouraged to supplant cool reason, fanaticism to supplant tolerance. Not by such means can our race be saved. Llewellyn Powys. Our interplanetary visitor is firmly convinced that all religion, no matter what its antiquity or its modernity may be, is an invention of our groping earthly minds. It occurs to him that it would be interesting and proper to lay aside all theology, all creed, all the superficial trappings placed by man about his conceptions of a deity, and consider only the basic God idea. The literature on the subject revealed to him that even on this broad and basic principle not all religionists were agreed. He found a threefold classification. 1. Those who held to the belief in an anthropomorphic personal God who was benevolent, omniscient, and omnipotent. 2. Those who saw in the constitution of our universe an impersonal supreme power who had created the universe, but who had not given us any revelation and thus has no need for worship by prayer and sacrifice. 3. Those who very recently conceived of the deity as a cosmic force, an ultimate, or as a mathematical or physical law. Such are the hypotheses of Jeans and Eddington. The Martian set about, therefore, with the principle that God is a hypothesis, and as such stands in need of proof. 1. The belief in a personal God. The Martian, as our guest, had by this time had ample opportunity to survey our civilization, and to acquaint himself with the things with which God, in his goodness, had endowed his earthly children. A proponent of a personal God informs him that his deity is an infinite personal being of consciousness, intelligence, will, good, unity, and beauty, the supreme, the infinite personality who was loving, benevolent, omnipotent, and omniscient. Like the American from Missouri, the visitor hastened to see for himself the marvelous workings of such an exalted being, for surely such a being, with such attributes as he was credited with, would certainly be in an excellent position to bestow great gifts upon his earthly children. The Martian is informed that the vast majority of our inhabitants, no matter what their geographical distribution may be, are suffering from a financial depression brought on by the last World War. War and cruelty are synonymous in the mind of our seeker for God, and immediately there arises a conflict between the conception of an omnipotent, all-wise, and loving God and one who would permit war and cruelty. Fearing that he has not comprehended the meaning of an omnipotent being, he turns to the lexicon for verification, only to learn that it means an all-powerful being. How then could an omnipotent being permit wholesale and private murder? Is he not rather a demon than a god? On the other hand, if this being is not omnipotent, then he is a useless god, and there is no need for all the fears which religion breeds, no need for creed and worship. Every war, particularly this last one, is an indictment of God. God's in his heaven, all's right with the world, is seemly only to the minds drugged with an irrational creed. If there is a God, he is quite careless of human well-being or human suffering. The deaths of 100,000 men mean no more to him than the deaths of 100,000 ants. A couple of million men locked in a death struggle on the battlefield is only a replica of the struggle that has been going on in the animal world throughout time. If there be a God, he designed all this. He fashioned the hooks for the slaughter, the teeth for the tearing, the talons for destruction, and man, with his multiplied weapons of destruction, has but imitated his example. A world without God, and in which humanity is gradually learning the way to better things, is an inspiration to renewed effort after the right. A world such as this, with God, is enough to drive insane all with intelligence enough to appreciate the situation. Chapman Cohen, War, Civilization, and the Churches. When the Martian investigated the annals of the World War, he found, despite the opportunities Providence had had of showing its benevolence, the affair of the sinking of the Lusitania, the torpedoing of hospital ships, vessels that were not engaged in fighting but in bringing home wounded men who had fought in God's cause. He found descriptions of the slaughter of men and women and children in air raids, and he naturally concludes that the providence of God is an insult to the earthly intelligence. Greatly disturbed, he picks up one of our newspapers, and the stories of hate and racial antagonism rear their ugly heads. These, together with jealousy and fear, seem to him to be the outstanding features of our attitudes. A benevolent, loving, omnipotent Father guiding our destinies, yet allowing such monstrosities to exist. The conundrum grows deeper as he proceeds. It is a bright day, and the Martian is aware of a headache brought on by the effort to understand the ways of earthlings, and therefore decides to drive through the city streets. Yet this drive affords him no relaxation, for on every side two diametrically opposed sights meet his keen eyes: luxury and poverty. Poverty and starvation, yet the Lord's Prayer, "Our Father which art in heaven, give us this day our daily bread." No Martian father would allow his children to starve. If he did, the law would fine him and imprison him. Since these earthlings are neglected by their Heavenly Father, and are powerless to indict him, the least they could do would be to stop paying tribute to him. If the God of these earthlings bothers not about them, why should they trouble about God? The Son of God, who could once create a miraculous batch of fish to satisfy a few fishermen, can do nothing to help these starving millions. Aloud he muses, "Is there no place on earth which is free from this contradiction?" His automobile happens to stop in front of an immense edifice marked "Hospital," and his curiosity is sufficiently aroused to cause him to alight and enter. The physician in charge courteously asks his distinguished visitor to inspect this refuge for those suffering with pain. He remembers that a religionist had told him that disease is a visitation of the Lord for our sins, in the same breath with which he had added that the Lord was loving and compassionate. If that were so, then this was the ideal place to witness the infinite goodness and compassion of the Creator of all earthlings. But the first scene to meet his gaze was that of a woman in childbirth. The torture, the excruciating pain, and the mental anguish of the human female before his eyes defied his Martian power of expression. This process of birth, it was explained to him, was not a pathological one, nor a disease, but a physiological function. To this the Martian could not refrain from replying, "From your own words, doctor, it is readily understood that your women experience a torture more acute, more nerve-wracking, and of longer duration than your Jesus experienced during his crucifixion. And your world commiserates and sheds oceans of tears when they contemplate the anguish of Jesus on the cross, but no mention is made of the agony which is the fate of every woman who brings another human being into this best of worlds." "But, my dear Martian," exclaims the physician, "the Heavenly Father has ordained that in anguish shall women bring forth their young." The other deliberated on the compassion of the benevolent Father in silence, and continued on his rounds through the hospital. Nearby was the crib containing a baby of a few days, suffering with a congenital heart disease. The infant's lips were blue, so was the body blue, and the gasping for breath and heaving of the small chest were pitiful to behold. "This infant," nonchalantly remarked the physician, "was born with a greatly defective heart. It will live for a few days, it will thirst for air, it will have intense air hunger. The lungs will fill with fluid, and then it will drown in its own secretions." The Martian recalled the time he had plunged under the water and remained there too long. Vividly he remembered the thirst for air, the seeming bursting of the lungs, the compression and vice-like grip of the muscles of the throat and chest, and he could not help exclaiming, "Benevolent, compassionate being." The physician continued, "This child," pointing to a beautiful, robust boy of 10 years, "was in perfect health until he fell in the street and received a minor cut which the parents treated with home remedies, but which in a few days was diagnosed as tetanus." And the doctor went on to explain that the compassion of the Lord is great when this occurs, for the child gets convulsions, the jaws become locked, and beads of cold sweat stand out on the child's forehead in his anguish. The convulsions increase in severity and in duration, so that finally they are continuous, and the child lies with the heels and back of the head only touching the bed. The rest of the body is arched. The convulsions then become so severe that the body is so bent backwards at times that the head and trunk touch the heels. The misery of such a child is sufficient to cause a physician to lose his reason. Again the Martian murmurs, "Verily, the compassion of the Lord is beyond understanding." The child in the next bed had just become paralyzed by an attack of poliomyelitis, infantile paralysis. The Martian observes how the Lord in his compassion saved a certain number of these children upon which he vents his anger for their sins, by inflicting upon them this hideous disease. He saves their lives, but to serve as an everlasting reminder, as a covenant between them and their Lord, he paralyzes their limbs. The spectacle of these children attempting to move, making intense effort to move paralyzed limbs, was the most revolting and heartbreaking sight that he had ever witnessed. This time, too, the Martian remarked, "Verily, the Lord in his infinite wisdom and goodness, strange tasks does perform." The physician then informed him of the many men and women who have died of cancer. A large number of these individuals had reached a period in life where they could just afford to relax from their struggles for mere sustenance, men and women who had reached a calm lake after journeying through troubled and tortuous waters, who had fought the good fight and had won the just reward of resting after their labors. But no, the Lord must trouble them for their sins. A group of these sufferers is shown to the Martian, and the normal course of this disease is explained. This time, all he can do is to protest that he firmly asserts that not one of our savage chiefs, even were he of the most primitive tribe, of the cruelest imagination, of the most base and insane nature, would nor could conceive of such torture as the loving Father conceived when he decided upon cancer as a visitation of our sins. The roasting of a witch alive is but a mere trifle compared to the long drawn out agony, the slow wasting, the anguish of a cancer patient watching himself sink to death. And when death mercifully releases this sufferer from his hellish torture, the preacher murmurs, "Lord, thy will be done." The Martian talks for a few moments with a sufferer from this disease and ascertains that the latter is a devout and true religionist, that he has been a good, moral churchgoer and has lived strictly according to the tenets of his creed, that he firmly and passionately believes that he has lived so that he will merit the reward of heaven, an everlasting sojourn in a land where there is no pain and suffering. And yet, this devout religionist, when he was informed that he had an incurable cancer, traveled the length and breadth of his land from one surgeon to another, allowing himself to be cut to pieces in order that he might remain on this earth but a moment longer, to stay and suffer the tortures of the damned when he might go to heaven and get his reward in the land where there is no pain. I wonder, mused the Martian, did the grim specter of death finally instill a grain of skepticism into his mind? Later, in the quiet of his chambers, he reviews the day's impressions. Cruelty, hate, fear, jealousy, racial antagonism, poverty, luxury, disease, pain, superstition, church, religion, and intolerance. If we suppose that the universe is the creation of an omnipotent and benevolent God, it becomes necessary to ask how pain and evil arise. Pain and evil are either real or unreal. If they are real, then God, who, being omnipotent, was bound by no limitations and constrained by no necessities, willfully created them. But the being who willfully creates pain and evil cannot be benevolent. If they are unreal, then the error which we make when we think them real is a real error. There is no doubt that we believe we suffer. If the belief is erroneous, then it follows that God willfully called falsehood into existence and deliberately involved us in unnecessary error. It follows once again that God cannot be benevolent. If we regard pain and evil as due to the wickedness of man, and not as the creation of God, we are constrained to remember that man himself is one of God's creations, God being conceived as all-creative, and received his wickedness, or his capacity for it, from whom? If we say that man had no wickedness to begin with, but willfully generated wickedness for himself, we have to face the double difficulty of accounting for a. How man, who is an emanation from God, can will with a will of his own which is not also a piece of God's will, and b. How a benevolent God could, assuming pain and evil to be a purely human creation, deliberately allow them to be introduced into a world that knew them not, when it was open to him to prevent such introductions. C.E.M. Joad, Mind and Matter. He had seen that crime and immorality exist now, just as they had existed before the belief in one personal God, and just as they promise to exist beyond our time. He had scrutinized evidence revealing the incontestable fact that most criminals were religious, and absolutely and proportionately a smaller number of criminals were non-believers in a personal deity. Judging by these alone, a belief in a benevolent, loving, omniscient, omnipotent, and compassionate being could not be sustained. Furthermore, if such a God ever existed, he certainly would have revealed his true religion to the first man, Adam. If he required prayer to satisfy his vanity, he surely would have told Adam how, when, why, and where to pray. Then again, once having neglected to inform his first model about all this, since he is omnipotent, he would certainly have instilled into the minds of men the true creed, so that no doubt could ever have entered into anyone's mind. What a universe of suffering he would have saved! The Martian is aware that a great number of Earthlings hold that every event must have a cause. Therefore the universe must have had a cause, which cause was God. Everything as it now exists in the universe is the result of an infinite series of causes and effects. Everything that happens is the result of something else that happened previously, and so on backwards to all eternity. Applying this reasoning that everything is the effect of some cause, and that a cause is the effect of some other causes, the theists work back from effect to cause and from cause to effect until they reach a first cause. By predicating a first cause, however, the theist removes the mystery a stage further back. This first cause they assume to be a cause that was not caused, and this first cause is God. Such a belief is a logical absurdity, and is an example of the ancient custom of creating a mystery to explain a mystery. If everything must have a cause, then the first cause must be caused, and therefore, who made God? To say that this first cause always existed is to deny the basic assumption of this theory. Moreover, if it is reasonable to assume a first cause as having always existed, why is it unreasonable to assume that the materials of the universe always existed? To explain the unknown by the known is a logical procedure. To explain the known by the unknown is a form of theological lunacy. The effect noted in any particular case is not of necessity related to a single cause, and science gives no assurance that causes and effects can be traced backward to a simple first cause. A man is so unfortunate as to contract pneumonia. What is the cause? An infection of the respiratory tract by the pneumococcus. It is not quite so simple as to ultimate causation. The person afflicted was harboring these germs in his nose and throat, and his resistance was weakened by wetting his feet. The day was cold and his shoes were thin. The humidity and temperature were such that rain fell. The temperature and humidity were caused by air currents hundreds of miles distant from the scene, and so ad infinitum. In this series of complications, where may we discern a first cause? When applied to the much more difficult problem of physical phenomena, we can conceive of an endless cycle of causes, but we cannot conceive of a first cause. Cause and effect are not two separate things. They are the same thing, viewed under two separate aspects. If cause and effect are the expressions of a relation, and if they are not two things but only one under two aspects, cause being the name for the related powers of the factors, and effect the name for their assemblage, to talk, as does the theist, of working back along the chain of causes until we reach God, is nonsense. Chapman Cohen, Theism or Atheism. A great many theists attempt to deduce the existence of an invisible creator and ruler of the universe from the visible features of nature, such as the design, regularity of movement and structure, and the various aspects of beauty which one may find in studying natural objects. This argument from design in nature has been overruled by a study of the evolutionary processes. Paley based his argument on the assertion of a mind beyond phenomena, the workings of which could be seen in the forms of animal life. The theists no longer use Paley's original arguments, but a great deal of the theistic arguments are still based on his assumptions. From the humanistic point of view, and the theist bases his entire arguments from design in nature from the humanistic view, an understanding of the merciless character of organic evolution shows clearly that the forces at work in nature are full of waste, there are numerous plans that are futile, there is an unrelenting preying of one form of life upon the other, and it is not always the higher form that is the victor. There are myriads of living organisms coming to life only to perish before reaching an age at which they can play their part in the perpetuation of the species. And there is a universe of pain and misery that serves no useful purpose. The impartial eye of science observes ugliness as well as beauty, disorder as well as order, in nature. If there is evidence of design in a rose, there is at least as much evidence of design in the tubercle bacillus and the tetanus bacillus. Whatever in nature produced the peacock, produced the itch mite. Whatever produced man, produced the spirochete of syphilis. If this earth is evolving for the better, the past is still vivid in all its cruelty. The old and familiar argument from design and beauty in nature is so inconsistent with the facts at hand that most theists have abandoned this attitude, and the retreat from this position has been turned into a veritable rout by the steady advance of scientific knowledge. God could, by exercising his omnipotence, reveal his existence with overpowering conviction at any moment, yet men have been searching for centuries for just the slightest evidence of his presence. The Martian, moreover, holds that the entire argument is irrelevant, for even if he grants that there is a supernatural being that fashions that which we behold at work in the universe, how can we say that he designed all this without first knowing what his intention was? Only by knowing the intention in the mind of a supernatural being before the act can we infer that something was designed. When the theist finds intention and design in nature, he is but reading his own feeling and desires into nature. Considering the universe as a whole, the Martian fails to find anything that suggests a conscious and purposive God, and certainly nothing to suggest a being that considers the welfare of man. The individual is not much interested in God as manifested in nature. What he is vainly seeking is God as providence. He is seeking an intelligence that his clergy tell him is devoted to his welfare, an intelligence that will guide his stumbling efforts, that will relieve him from war and misery, that will shield the innocent from pain and poverty. He finds that his clergy cannot point to one clear trace of the action of God in human affairs. In the whole long record of man's career, the finger of God cannot be found pointing to one well-substantiated fact. The Martian considers the theistic argument that it would be impossible to have an orderly universe merely resulting from the inherent properties of natural forces, and that directivity is necessary to keep the universe on its present track. Keeping in mind the scientific conception of the universe and the knowledge at hand concerning the atoms and their properties, it is inconceivable that any other arrangement than the present one should have resulted. The Martian cannot marvel as most earthlings do that the present order exists as it does. The marvel to him would be if any other order should be, or that any radical alteration in it should occur. He perceives that the state of the universe at any moment is the result of all the conditions then prevailing, and that the natural forces possess the capacity to produce the universe as we see it. It matters not what the ultimate nature of these forces may be, electrons, protons, electricity, or wave energy, these material forces possess the capacity to produce the universe as we see it. If these forces do not possess this capacity, it is indeed difficult for the Martian to conceive in what way even a directing and supreme mathematician, an ultimate, or any supernatural power however designated, could produce this capacity. Unless the capacity for producing the universe as we see it existed in the atoms themselves, no amount of direction could have produced it. The property of the atom and its combinations to produce the material universe is therefore inherent in the atoms themselves and does not necessitate the operation of a deity. The order manifest in the universe is the necessary consequence of the persistence of force. If a supernatural intelligent force existed, the Martian believes that the claims of the theist would in no way be better substantiated than if this controlling force would in some way manifest an inhibitive influence and prevent certain things occurring which would have transpired but for his interference. Such manifestations have not occurred, It is impossible for the theist to show any instance in which the normal consequences of known forces did not transpire in which the aberration could not be accounted for by the operation of other known forces. A law of nature is not a statute drawn up by a legislator, it is the interpretation and the summation which we give to the observed facts. The phenomena which we observe do not act in a particular manner because there is a law, but we state the law because they act in that particular manner. It cannot be said that the laws of nature are the result of a lawmaker. It cannot be affirmed that a supreme intelligence told things in nature to act just that way and no other. If the theist claims that a supreme intelligence issued laws for his own pleasure and without any reason, then he must admit that there is something which is not subject to law and the train of natural law is interrupted. If it is claimed that a supreme intelligence had a reason for the laws which he gave, the reason being to create the best possible universe, then it follows that God himself was subject to law, and there is no advantage in introducing God as an intermediary. This contention would make it appear that there is a law outside and anterior to the divine edicts, and God does not serve the purpose of the theist since he is not the ultimate lawgiver. The anthropomorphic conception of God, our Martian finds, is now denied by most cultured theists. Nevertheless, they still maintain a belief in a deity endowed with consciousness. Professor H. N. Wieman states that God is superhuman but not supernatural. He is a present, potent, operative, observable reality. He is more worthy of love than any other beloved. He is one to whom men can pray and do pray, and who answers prayer. This can be understood to be not greatly removed from the fundamentalist's conception of God. But when he continues to say, God is that interaction between individuals, groups, and ages which generates and promotes the greatest possible mutuality of good, and it responds to prayer and is precisely what answers prayer when prayer is answered, the personal he has suddenly changed to the impersonal it. Emotions and intelligence are connected with nerve structures in all sentient beings that we have experience and knowledge of. How can we attribute these qualities to a being who is described to us as devoid of any nerve structure? In former ages, the theist saw God in the color and construction of a flower, in the starry heavens, and in a sunset or sunrise. The biologists have driven the theists from this misconception. The physicists have explained the phenomena of sunset and sunrise, and with the advance of astronomy, the heavens no longer proclaim the glory of God, and the theistic arguments have shifted from worlds to atoms. At the present moment, the vision of God has narrowed down to a perception of the divine intelligence noted in the design of the atom. Astronomy, physics, geology, chemistry, medicine, psychology, ethics, aesthetics, and the social sciences have left no room for a theistic explanation of the universe. The mystics who proclaim God in their intuitive trances are being crowded out into the light of reason by the researches of psychologists. There are still many gaps in our knowledge, and if the theist persists in finding the manifestation of a supreme being in these vague zones of our present ignorance, he is at the mercy of the science of the future. Science is concerned with mind as much as it is with the material aspects of atoms and stars, hence the sciences of psychology, ethics, and aesthetics. The entire universe is the province of science, and it is rapidly providing a scientific interpretation of all the contents of the universe. It may well be a few more centuries before the scientific explanation is partially complete, but it must be kept in mind that science as we conceive the term is less than 2,500 years old, and out of this infantile period at least 1,000 years must be deducted for the intellectual stagnation of the Dark Ages. In tracing the retreat of the clergy from the arguments from the first cause, the arguments from design, causation, and directivity, the Martian recalls the words of Vivian Phillips. How is it that God allowed earnest and learned divines to commit themselves to arguments in proof of his existence, the subsequent overthrow of which has been a potent cause for unbelief? The finite mind cannot expect to understand the infinite, retorts a theist to our Martian. What manner of reasoning is this, asks our Martian, that denies my finite mind the right to question the proofs of the existence of an infinite, when these same proofs are derived by finite minds? The theist cannot infer God from the cosmic process until he can discover some feature of it which is unintelligible without him. 2. The belief in a deity, but the rejection of revelations, theology, priestcraft, and church. To the Martian, the opinion held by these individuals presented two difficulties. First, if the adherents of this hypothesis considered their deity as a providence which took an active part in the life of this world, then the objections heretofore stated against belief in a personal God are still valid. Secondly, if they considered this being as only a creator who then leaves this world to its own resources, they are only assuming a philosophical existence behind phenomena. Such a being, they believe, they deduce intellectually. But actually who created this creator? They assume a God who remains always hidden behind phenomena, but such a God has no connection with the God that the religious man worships and to whom he prays for guidance and for blessings, for actual interference in the life of this world. Such theories impress our visitor as but a feeble attempt at new concepts of the same hypothetical deity, and it seemed to him that we already had sufficient ideas of God to trouble our earthly minds. 3. The God of the physicists. It was brought to the Martian's attention that two scientists, Sir Arthur Eddington, a British astronomer, and Sir James Jeans, a mathematical physicist, had still another concept of God. According to Eddington, phenomena all boil down to a scheme of symbols, of mathematical equations. He admits that this mathematics of nature does not explain anything. They do not define reality, they only define the relations that exist between the phenomena of reality. So far does he go, and then his limited mind, our Martian perceives, meets an obstacle that he cannot explain. He, therefore, abandons the formula and returns to the human mind which has conceived this formula. From the spiritual essence of man's nature, he assumes the spiritual nature of the cosmos itself, which he finds in what religion has known for centuries as God. To him, it is impossible to explain the universe except in terms of spirit. Professor Jeans insists that in the equations which reveal the relations between phenomena, there may reside also the revelation of the ultimate, which these phenomena express. He believes that there may exist a great architect of the universe who is a pure mathematician. However, the Martian argues, is it not a fact that in your earthly experience you have created your gods in your own image? Your savages created God in the only fashion their mental capacities could supply, in the shape of an idol. Now the modern physicist creates his God in the light of his own intimate vision, which is that of a mathematician. This is just another attempt to formulate a hypothetical existence of a supernatural being. The theologians, by this time thoroughly aroused, lay down a verbal barrage, and learned Jesuits place before the visitor a recent publication entitled The Question and Answer by Hilaire Belloc. The author, acting as the mouthpiece of the Roman Catholic Church, attempts to prove two things, namely, whether God is, and that the witness to revelation is the Roman Catholic Church. Were it not for the fact that the work was published by permission of the Church, one could logically suppose from its arguments that the author was attempting to give the answer "no" to the question propounded as to whether God is. There is one sentence, however, to which the Martian agrees. This one: "But religions, though not very numerous, considering the vast spaces of time over which we can study them, and the vast number of millions to which they apply, differ and contradict each other, on which account anyone approaching this problem for the first time, and being made acquainted at the outset with the variety of religions, would naturally conclude that every religion is man-made, and every religion an illusion." On reading the opening remarks, the Martian exclaims, "This earthling plainly tells us at the beginning that he will make his theories fit in with his conclusion. He informs us that he does not seek the truth no matter where it may lead, but he only deems it necessary to fit ideas, no matter how distorted, in order that the final conclusion will simulate what he deliberately sets out to prove. Mr. Belloc's statement, 'How many men will agree that wanton cruelty, treason to family or the state, falsehood for private gain, breach of faith, are admirable?' strikes the Martian as absurd when viewed in the light of the historical annals of the Church itself. Mr. Belloc's creed must have considered those very vices as virtues, judging from the actions of his Church. In calling the Roman Catholic Church the witness to revelation, the author continues with, 'Yet that it should suffer from men's hatred and persecution. If God has divinely ordained this institution as his Church on earth, and in his omnipotence and omniscience allows this Church to be hated, then how do the religionists assume that their God is a God of love? The author tells us that he is a God of hate, such a God as was conceived of by the barbarians and the Hebrews, cruel, vengeful, and monstrous. Does not this apologist confuse his God with his devil? Then again, has it not occurred to this apologist that he is in all futility attempting to prove something which is a contradiction within itself? If God is, and is benevolent, is it not logical to assume, since the theologians assume all sorts of attributes to this deity, that he would not have constructed the minds of men when he created them so as to desire to doubt his being, would not have tortured the minds of men with cruel doubt as to his existence? If he is omnipotent, it would have been just as easy to instill into the minds of men only the strongest desire to believe in his reality, and even that would not be necessary had he so arranged matters that by his everlasting presence he would reveal himself or his deeds to man in such a conclusive manner that even the feeblest of intellects could not doubt his existence. If he is omniscient, as the parable asserts, that not a hair falls from the head of man, not a sparrow dies without his knowledge, it must therefore be apparent that he created man with the foreknowledge that man would doubt his existence. This is a contradiction in itself. The Martian notes that in the entire length of the work not a reference is made to the time-worn theological defense, the revelation, which the Church has always claimed for its scriptures. Appended as an afterthought, as an apology, as it were, for the philosophical defense and not the theological, the Jesuit father reminds the reader of its Messiah, Jesus and the New Testament. The Jesuit states, "The New Testament writings, considered merely as trustworthy historical documents, inform us that..." But at this point the Martian interrupted the speaker, for the audacity of any learned man terming the New Testament writings historical was beyond his comprehension. It brought forcibly to his attention the great change which the apologies for the Church had undergone and the new methods which they assumed. The old theological defense of the Deity was gone. Not even philosophy was deemed strong enough support for the present day. How the Church had fallen! The Church, which had persecuted, anathematized, burned, and tortured the scientist, the geologist, the astronomer, the geographer, the biologist, the chemist, and the physician, this same Church, in its last extremis, casts aside theology as its weapon and its appeal to the minds of the skeptics whom they aim to convert. The Church casts aside its own theology, having learned by bitter experience and recanting of opinions, bulls, and infallible statements by infallible popes, and now succumbs to the opinions it has formerly anathematized. In the present age, the Church calls science to its aid, and utterly disregards its obsolete theology which it still practices, and attempts, by means of the misinterpretation of scientific facts and statements of a few men such as Eddington and Jeans, to force science into some illogical and unscientific concordance with the conception of a supreme being. Ironically, it occurs to the Martian that the shades of Hypatia, Bruno, Galileo, Copernicus, Vanini, Darwin, and the vast numbers of Waldenses, Albigenses, Huguenots, Jews, and the victims of the Inquisition and the witch hunt must, as they contemplate the present tactics of that holy institution, the Church, find some consolation in the depths of that hell to which the Church consigned them. The Martian logically deduces that by employing science for its defense, the Church admits the impotence of divine revelation, in this age, to convince even its own adherents of the problematical existence of a divine being. Theology is no longer recognized as authoritative even by theologians. Will the theologians now disregard their theology based on the supernatural, and build a system of theology based on science? Is this all that is left to the theologian, that he must use the pitiful theology of gaps? That is, wherever there are gaps in scientific knowledge, the theologians insert their idea of God. This is but the replacing of the question mark with a meaningless label. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of the Necessity of Atheism. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Wessling. The Necessity of Atheism by David Marshall Brooks. Chapter 5. The Persistence of Religion. We believe what we believe, not because we have been convinced by such and such arguments, but because we are of such and such a disposition. C. E. M. Joad. The mind of the ordinary man is in so imperfect a condition that it requires a creed, that is to say, a theory, concerning the unknown and the unknowable in which it may place its deluded faith and be at rest. Winwood Reade. Generations followed, and what had been offered as hypothetical theological suppositions were, through custom and tradition, taken for granted as unquestioned truth. Llewellyn Powys. The Martian has had his attention drawn to the statement that religion in some form or other has existed from most primitive times down to the present day. The theologians point to this as a proof of the existence of a supreme being. An investigation of this assertion leads the Martian to the conclusion that religions have continued to exist mainly because of the power which inherited superstitions wield over mankind. Men are born with a marked tendency towards superstitions. Certain isolated families of men are born with an inherited tendency towards tuberculosis. Most of these are born not with an active tuberculosis, but some as yet imperfectly understood tendency, a defect in their protoplasmic makeup that renders them an easy prey to the tubercle bacillus if they are exposed to it. Similarly, generations of men have been born with a weakened mental vitality towards superstition, a weakened mental capacity that renders their minds an easy prey to that fear which manifests itself in superstition, creed, religion, the God idea. It was Karl Marx who remarked that the tradition of all the generations of the past weighs down like an Alp upon the brain of the living. Since the days of our racial childhood, our beliefs have been handed down from generation to generation, and they have persisted since in all ages it was forbidden to question their existence. Man has persuaded himself that it is so, just because he has said it for so long and so often. The force of repetition is great. It is, in fact, taken by a vast majority of men as the equivalent of proof. Most men have to accept their religions ready-made. Their daily tasks leave them no time or opportunity for a personal search. The toil for bread is incessant. There is not sufficient leisure to verify the sources of their religious beliefs. Moreover, the ecclesiastic's answers to the riddles of life are easier by far to grasp than the answers of science. These two factors of innate mental inertia and force of repetition are well manifested by the present tactics of advertising. The manufacturer of any product well knows that the constant repetition and the dangling of his product before the eyes of the public will lead to a widespread acceptance of the advertising slogans propounded for his article. The force of so-called authority has aggravated this mental inertia. It takes a tremendous amount of willpower and mental courage for any individual to assert an opinion that runs counter to the accepted mode of thinking. It is much easier and much more pleasant to give oneself passively to that delusion of grandeur, that delusion that pleasantly drugs the mind with the assumption that there is a supreme being who is personally interested in our well-being, a providence who, like a schoolmaster, at his pleasure dispenses rewards and punishments, as immortality, heaven and hell. So firmly has this become entrenched in the minds of men that the irrationalities which manifest themselves against such a conception make no impression. Schopenhauer well states, "Nothing is more provoking when we are arguing against a man with reasons and explanations and taking all pains to convince him, than to discover at last that he will not understand, that we have to do with his will." The Martian, knowing the widespread extent of religious beliefs and their supposed influence in our daily lives, is prepared to find in our annals a vast literature that would attest to the overwhelming benefits that mankind had derived from his religious beliefs. He is amazed to find that the little good which religion had accomplished had occurred at the time when our race was in its infancy. Just as fear is instilled into the mind of the child to protect it from the dangers of its environment before the child has reached the age where it can use its reason for protection, just so had religion, by its implantation of fear, served its purpose in the days of our racial childhood. The child, however, as soon as it learns to reason, replaces those fears by a logical comprehension of the laws governing his environment. But in religious matters, this fear has clung to man tenaciously, and while at first serving a protective function, at the present stage of civilization constitutes an embryonic impediment. The assertion of ecclesiastics that without the aid of religious learning and influence our civilization would have been retarded is a statement that a study of the development of man shows to be directly opposed to the facts. That religion has been the greatest impediment in the road to progress. This will be shown in the subsequent chapters. The oft-repeated assertion that, during the Middle Ages, ecclesiastic influence was the saving grace is well refuted by Dr. William J. Robinson. We are told by the church apologists that during the Middle Ages the priests and monks kept up the torch of learning, that, being the only literate people, they brought back the study of the classics. Historically speaking, this is about the most impudent statement that one could imagine. It was the Church that retarded human progress at least 1,000 years. It is the Church that put a thick, impenetrable pall over the sun of learning and science, so that humanity was enveloped in utter darkness. And if the priests and monks later learned to read and write, from the Arabs, Jews, and Greeks exiled from Constantinople after 1453, it is because they wanted to keep the power in their hands. The people they did not permit to learn either to read or write. Even the reading of the Bible, bear in mind, was considered a crime. We are told that the priests and monks built hospitals and gave alms to the poor. Having gotten enormous tracts of the best land into their hands, so that the people were starving, they were willing to throw a bone occasionally to the latter. It cost them nothing, and it gave them a reputation for charity. They built enormous monasteries with well-filled cellars, and lived on the fat of the land, while the people lived in wretched hovels, working their lives away for a crust of bread. The beasts, the domestic animals, lived a more comfortable life than did the men, women, and children of the people. And the Church never raised a finger to ameliorate their condition. It kept them in superstitious darkness and helped the temporal lords, for a long period the spiritual were also the temporal lords, to keep them in fear, subjection, and slavery. The Martian, being an impartial observer, examined what had been done by Christianity for the intellectual and material advancement of humanity during her long reign, and what had been done by science and purely secular knowledge in its brief period of activity, the period when science and secular knowledge had partially liberated themselves from ecclesiastical domination. He came to the conclusion that in instituting a comparison, he had established a contrast. End of chapter 5.